room. So next week we will have Leo Cromer will come back and finish his series on your health and nutrition, and then after that we'll have 4 weeks of David Drum, and he's going to do on the Upanishads into. So that should be interesting. So we'll have him. So we just have a limited amount of time, and he's got a lot to finish. So it's yours.
Thank you so much, Carol. Thank you. It is true that I hate it when it's over, but then I immediately start looking forward to seeing you in May or June, whenever we can put together our fall series, spring series, actually summer, and it's going to be in the evening. It's going to be a series that will be a little more generic in the sense that it's not necessarily religious based. Usually, what I do here on Sunday morning is religious history. But sometimes I'll do religious history, sometimes I'll do secular history. I've done the history of cars. And I think last year I did the history of sugar and spice, and that was really
Everything nice.
yeah, and everything nice. So we have a wide variety of topics. Anyway, trying to do this Sunrise of Christianity is typical of what I do. I try to cut off a big slice of the pie, and we only eat a little bit of it. There's so much to talk about and so many things to talk about. So I get bogged down on details, but then again, this is important because people seem to love these little digressions that we go into from time to time. We got some more folks coming in here. Let's let them come and get seated while I write down a word. Anybody know what this word is? Apotheosis? Apotheosis? Anybody? Apotheosis? Okay. Let me tell you when the word really started to come onto my radar. So I was doing an institute, National Endowment for the Humanities Institute in Washington, D.C., which I did this past summer. I've done many of them. But anyway, we were in the Capitol one time, and I'm looking up, to see beautiful murals and paintings and all this, and just standing there, and there's guides all over giving talks, right? And so I'm hearing this, but I'm not on purpose. This man just is speaking, and I happen to hear what he's saying. He says, and in the oculus, we have to stop there, oculus. This is Roman, this is Latin for eye, right? In the famous Pantheon in Rome, Theo, God, Pan, all, temple to all the gods, Pantheon. This is the most famous Roman temple in the world, primarily because it survives. It was built with concrete and not stone, and because it was built kind of late in the Roman period, it survived, and then the Christianity took it over as a church, and because it took it over church, they kept it up. So that's the only building that I can think of. You can walk into a Roman building and see it almost as it was. Almost. And when I walked in there for the first time, I was so flabbergasted I just couldn't get over it. Because what you see when you go to Italy and Greece, you just see ruins, endless ruins. And you have to use your imagination. What did this building look like? But when you go into the Pantheon, this should be a capital P here. When you go into the Pantheon, you see it, the incredible achievement of the Romans in architecture, building, technology, all of that put together. Well, anyway, so in the Pantheon, there's an oculus, an eye, which means an opening. And that way light would come in from the very top. It's the eye to heaven. Now, what's amazing is I asked So when I saw this, I said, well, how come it doesn't rain in here? Or snow, for that matter. They get snow in Rome. They said, well, because of this. Heat, the heat of the bodies of people rises. And because it's all focused toward the oculus, in other words, everything's going up and can only go out one place, the air pressure is greater coming out than going in. So the rain doesn't, generally speaking, come in. And so that just astounded me, the brilliance of that, right? Well, so anyway, when they did the Washington, D.C. Capitol, they put in an oculus, but where the opening should be, there is a painting of Washington, right? And so this guide is over here, and I'm kind of looking around. He said, look at the oculus, and there is Washington in his apotheosis. Now, apotheosis. I remember the word. It means, this means like to change. Theo, God, this is the form. In other words, to change into God, to become God, to be deified. See, in Latin, this is another word for God. This is, Theo is, this actually comes from Greek. But, the Romans borrowed it, but they also had their own word for God, the Dios, Dio, in this case, deify, right? So, God deified. And man, this happens to me every once in a while in my life. Somebody will say something, it might be on the radio, it might be passing by, it might be a student. They'll say something, they'll say, by the way, and this is one of those moments I just knocked over. The apotheosis of Washington, and there he is in a kind of a toga, wearing purple, which is the color of royalty. And the Romans, of course, they were still in the ancient world, so leaders tend to be apotheosized. They tend to be turned into gods. This was particularly the case during the empire, where the emperors were considered gods, and many of them wanted to be worshipped, right? But the apotheosis of Washington? Are you kidding?
We're talking George.
We're talking George. We are in the U.S. Capitol, in the rotunda, where only the most famous, the only most important people, when they die. So when George W. Bush died, where did they put him? Right below Washington, right directly. And the apotheosis of Washington.
Literally on the top.
And the very pinnacle. Yeah,
You
there's
look up
where the oculus.
There's not literally an opening.
No,
I don't know.
right. In other words, they couldn't. They didn't put the opening. If you think about
It just
the Capitol,
suggests.
it goes back to the Pantheon,
Right.
and then then on to St. Peter's Basilica, and this theme, it has the same thing, but instead of putting Oculus up there, which would have made things very cold, in the winter, right? Not so much so in Rome. They plastered over it, and then they had this famous Italian artist do the apotheosis of Washington. Whoa, man, how did this come to pass? Well, there's another famous statue which is hidden away somewhere in the Smithsonian. It used to be in the rotunda, and it's also the apotheosis of Washington. It's Washington sitting on his throne as a god, the apotheosis of Washington, in the statue form. Wearing a toga, it looks weird, right? but here's the thing. Here we are, we're supposed to be the great egalitarian nation, the separation of church and state, right? And there you have Washington as a god. Does anybody find that odd, strange, unusual? Yeah. Okay.
Especially in Washington.
Yeah. There he is with his toga. And so this is, if you ever needed evidence, the United States models itself after the Roman Republic. There it is. But in this process, they turn Washington, into an emperor, and then they turn him into a god. So we treat our celebrities and sometimes our dead presidents like gods, but in this case it's literally. They put them up there. Okay, so apotheosis is a really interesting, important concept. The Romans, in other words, had no problem with thinking of a human being as also being God. Now, this is crucially important to understanding how Christianity could come into the Roman, because the fundamental concept, of course, of Christianity is that God comes to us in human form. And that's crucial. Now, the other thing the Romans had was the concept of incarnation. To come into carne. Incarnation. In other words, to come into carne means flesh. Now, we have this word here and there in our culture. For example, somebody says, "Are you a vegan?" And you say, "No, I'm a carnivore." Okay? Carnivore. I go over to that Brazilian place where they you've been there?
Meat, more meat.
Yeah, it's like meat, more meat, right? So when I went, somebody invited us and said, "We're going to eat this Brazilian place." I'm going, I wonder if that's weird. And so we get over there, and I didn't understand the concept, because I guess people assumed I just knew about this. I'd never been before. So you have a little button at this particular, I think it's Texas, Brazil, and you have a little button on your table, and if you leave it up, they're supposed to keep cutting, right, the meat. And if you put it down, that means stop, right? So you can also just do this, but I didn't really know this. So it comes over with what looks to me like a prime rib, one of these servers on a spit. And he looks down, my plate's empty, so he goes like this. He just keeps going. Higher. And I said, whoa, because I'm busy talking to somebody. Whoa, okay. So he goes away, and then, but what I didn't realize, I thought that was the deal, right? He'd come over and do the prime rib. But I didn't realize they have 8 different meats, right? So they have the lamb guy, and then they have pork and all this stuff, right? So I had all this meat. I didn't know what to do with it. Didn't realize they also have the potatoes and the vegetables and all the rest of the stuff, right? But that is a carnivore's dream. Have you ever, anybody here ever been out to the place in Amarillo, 72-ounce steak? Don't tell me, Colin, you took a shot at that. Okay,
No,
so
I was a vegetarian at the time.
Oh, thank God. So anyway, here's the deal. Only in Texas, if you've never seen it, they will give you a free meal of a steak that's 72 ounces. Now, if you do the math, how many pounds is that? 5 times 12, This is 60. This is 72.
Yeah.
So now it's
Ooh, it's 6.
6 pounds. Okay. So I'll give you a 6 pound taste. That's bad enough. But then you have to have all the trimmings. So you have to have the baked potato, and you have to have, I think you have some choices, beans and different things, right? But the point is, it's absolutely free if you eat it in 60 minutes. 60 minutes. And they have thousands of people stop. And you have to pay up front. Now, you know, it started out $39.99, it's probably up to $100 now, I don't know. But you pay for it up front, and then they give you your money back if you eat it all. But so few people have done it, they have their photos. About 100 photos on the wall. Who was there? You were there. Anybody else there? So, it's just shocking what that would do to your system.
Yeah.
Just take, 6 pounds and put it in there. But in Texas, that's possible. All these things are possible. Anyway, incarnation. Let's do this word. Shelley, Carney.
Carne asada is another dish.
Huh?
Carne asada is a Mexican dish,
Yes, of course.
a steak dish.
Yeah, but it's become American because we all go to Mexican restaurants. And so we can have our meat with chili if we want it. Chili con carne. You can also have you can go to a diner and get what's called a Coney Island. It took me years to figure out that a Coney Island is just a hot dog with chili on top of it, right? And but anyway, chili con carne. So if you think about it, it means chili with flesh. But for some reason with meat, we don't use the word flesh unless it's in that form. But even so, if it's cooked, it's called meat. But even when you go into the grocery store, right? You go to the meat section. They never say the flesh section. Yes.
But in German, don't they use Fleisch for
Yes.
meat?
Yes, they do. So that is why. And again, this goes back to the old thing about German and French, right? So we say flesh. This comes from the German. We say meat. We say beef. We say cow. We say, we just back and forth, back and forth. My favorite, I didn't think I gave this to you. The word gentleman. Gentle is French, man is German. So we have a number of words like this that are French and German fused together. But this is, we're so used to doing it that we never think about it. Well, anyway, incarnation then means to come into flesh, and it's related then to the concept that Jesus comes to earth and comes into flesh, right? So I ask this question, and I very rarely get people, certainly not my students, but rarely do people know the actual annual date of the incarnation. So, anybody here know the date? Every year, date of the incarnation.
Of Jesus?
Of Jesus. The date of the incarnation of Jesus. In other words, the Roman Catholic Church celebrates all these feast days. And they have a feast day for the incarnation of Jesus. And the feast day of Jesus' incarnation is?
December 8th?
No. Feast day of Jesus. In other words, ask yourself the question, when did Jesus come into flesh?
Was it something like 5 days after he was on the cross?
No. The resurrection is historic by tradition on Sunday. But remember, in the Jewish calendar, Sunday starts at what we call sundown on Saturday. So we, that's important. But when is Jesus' flesh?
When he was born.
When he's born. That's a good answer, and that's, of course, would be Christmas. But no, that is not the date that the church celebrates the incarnation.
January.
January? No.
February, March.
April.
It takes a doctor.
March.
It takes a doctor to figure this one out. It's the conception.
Oh.
Now you don't need to look this up. You can figure out this with your brain. When is he conceived in the church calendar? According to church calendar.
Immaculate March.
Yes, it is an immaculate conception. It's immaculate. His conception was immaculate, and then of course his mother's conception was immaculate, according to the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Anybody want to take a shot at this? So, how long does conception take?
9 months.
So 9 months before December 25th is? Now March 25th ought to be a very important church event, but it almost goes by without notice. The reason is because March 25th gets into the period of time when we can have Easter. We can have Easter by the March 25th. Remember, Easter has to always be, you have to go to the vernal equinox, March 21st, and then March 21st, the vernal equinox, then you have to go to the full moon, which could be the next day. So you have to have the full moon, you have to march the vernal equinox, in other words, halfway between the shortest day and the longest day. March 21st, then you have to have a full moon, and then you have to have a Sunday. Now, by the way, why is this part of here? Because this is how you figure out when Passover is. And remember, the crucifixion and resurrection took place right at the time of Passover. But Sunday, because Jesus is risen from the dead on a Sunday. And so this would be, this by tradition, and we call it Easter. Now, you talk about something weird. Why is Easter called Easter? Yes, because of the Germanic god named Ostar. And Ostar is derived ultimately back from Ishtar.
Which is Egyptian.
No, Ishtar, Babylonian.
Oh.
Yeah, and ultimately Ishtar goes back, to ISIS, for example. But anyway, this is, you can study this whole thing, but you come to this, what happened is, these Germanic tribes, the Anglos, the Saxons, and the Jews, had been exposed to the goddess Ostar along the Danube, because these Phoenician traders would come way up the Danube from the Black Sea, and they were exposed, and they brought with him her idol, and they told what a wonderful goddess she was. And so many of the Germanic people started worshiping her, and so she is one of the other, Ostar becomes one of the other versions of the German mother goddess is Freya, from which we get Friday. Yes, ma'am?
I was wondering where the word Istare came, because
Same.
that's where I had always...
Yes, the Istare is right in between here. Istare, or Astarte, there's a number of versions. Our word star ultimately derives from that. Astarte, Istare, there are about 4 or 5 versions of this. This is, of course, the Phoenician. This is Phoenician. But all these are interrelated and connected, all right? So anyway, these Germans started worshiping Ostar, right? So about when Julius Caesar and the Romans leave England, it's open kind of for anybody to come. And the tribes that come are Germanic tribes. We know them all today as the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Angles were the largest. That's why we call it Angleland, or we spell it today with an E, England, right? And so Anglia, like you have East Anglia, West Anglia, these are where the Angles settle. And then the Saxons, anything you have like an X, SX, Essex, Wessex, Sussex, see?
Sexist.
Very good, very clever of you. Yeah, very clever.
I've been told that.
Yeah. The Jutes, we call them Danish today, but anyway, they all came and they worshiped this goddess, right? And when was her celebration? The first full moon after the vernal equinox, right? So when the missionaries came, they were trying to communicate with these people, and they'd say, they were telling the story of Jesus, and they'd say Jesus was resurrected first full moon after vernal equinox. And they said, oh, well, we call that Easter tide. In other words, we call that, because the word Ostar ultimately evolves the word Easter. You can see the astar there. If you take out the E, you can see the astar there. Tide is what we call now time, at Easter time. And so when they translate, when they create German, written form of German, they then write this down. And Jesus was resurrected at Easter time. Because they would immediately know what they were talking about. In other words, they would need to know what time it was. Well, over time, this got dropped. And they would just say, because commonly used words and phrases over time always get shortened. So instead of saying Easter time, they just say Easter. So Jesus was resurrected at Easter. See? Amazing, stunning, that one of the most holiest of all Christian days is the name of this ancient mother goddess, right? Very, very ironic in a way. Now, we have the incarnation, and then we have another very important use of this word, carni, in the word carnival. Okay? Now, carnival today, this word has gone through a long evolution. And carnival today, if I say, let's go to the carnival, you'd say, oh, yeah, I'd sure like some cotton candy, or something like that. A carnival now just means a place where you do some rides, and there'll be some games of chance. Basically, the midway at the State Fair of Texas is a carnival, right? And the carnival, though, started out as a religious, important religious day of the year. So carnival starts out with the 40 days before Easter. You start the preparation for Easter. 40 days where you you practice self-mortification. That is, you fast, you deny yourself, and then that'll make you in preparation to go through the Passion Week, and then ultimately to celebrate on Easter, all right? So this is 40 days before Easter, and we call this period of time, these 40 days, we call this is Lent. Lent being a word related to spring, because it always comes in the spring, right? Now, in Texas, Lent, since Easter moves, Lent moves, and therefore Carnival moves. Now, what is Carnival? Carnival is the last day, in other words, the 41st day, the last day that you can have fat, flesh. Basically, you can, anything that has fat in it. For example, you can't have a hamburger because a hamburger has fat in it, right? So what else does this include? This includes eggs, milk, oil, and also it includes alcohol, no alcohol.
Does that include vegetable oil?
No, it does not include vegetable oil. That is correct. And this, of course, back historically, they knew nothing of vegetable oil. Vegetable oil is 20th century. They started squeezing it out of corn or canola beans or
What
whatever.
about the olive, though?
Olive oil would be considered vegetable oil. So, but usually, even today, we will say vegetable oil or olive oil. Olive oil, usually has its own terminology. So if you can go buy vegetable oil and then look and see what's in it. But if it's olive oil, because it's much more expensive, so they'll say extra virgin olive oil, right? Which means the very first pressing of the oil. So yes, olive oil would be allowed because it is from vegetable, all right? So anyway, yeah, there are a few loopholes. So what people did, of course, is they made a day where they had a big blowout, a big celebration for one last time, because for 40 days you can't get your Big Mac, for 40 days you can't eat your steak, for 40 days you can't eat flesh, right? So no fish either, right? Long John Silver's, so forth. Now, this became, particularly among Roman Catholics in Italy and Spain and France and so forth, this just became such a huge deal. And so the carnival was a time of great festivity. And what they would do in England is they would gather together, everybody would go in to their pantry and they'd pull out all the eggs, they'd pull out all the, anything like sausage, for example,